The auction hall fell silent as an old man in tattered clothes walked in with a gleaming white stallion. Moments earlier, the wealthy elites had been laughing, whispering behind their champagne glasses about his worn boots and patched vest. They thought he was lost, a country bumpkin who wandered into Tennessee's most prestigious horse sale by mistake. But when an elderly spectator stood up and gasped, "That's Moonlight Legend, the champion everyone thought died in the Pine Valley fire 13 years ago," their laughter died instantly. The shabby man they'd mocked wasn't just some farmer. He was Michael Cooper, the stable hand who'd been wrongfully blamed for that infamous fire. And he'd returned with living proof of the scandal that would bring down the most powerful family in racing. The Golden Creek auction represented everything exclusive about Tennessee's horse racing world. The air was thick with expensive perfume, polished wood, and privilege. Wealthy buyers from across the globe lined the railings, sipping champagne and examining their programs with jeweled fingers. This was where fortunes changed hands over thoroughbreds worth millions. The auction hall smelled of polished wood, fresh sawdust, and old money. Dozens of well-dressed attendees lined the railings, whispering behind tight smiles and sipping champagne. This was the Golden Creek Thoroughbred Sale, one of the most prestigious events in Tennessee's racing calendar. Every eye was fixed on the wide entry gate, expecting the next hybrid stallion to prance in with fanfare and applause. But instead came silence. Through the gates stepped a weathered old man, his boots scuffed and jeans torn at the knee. His vest hung loose, patched in more places than it was whole. A flat cap shadowed his wrinkled face, but it wasn't the man that caused the first gasp. It was the horse beside him, a tall, powerful thoroughbred, its gray-white coat almost glowing under the arena lights. The animal moved with effortless grace, as if it floated above the reddish dirt floor. A soft ripple of laughter rolled across the crowd. The wealthy and powerful rarely encountered anyone who didn't belong to their exclusive world, and they were quick to judge. Someone whispered about a publicity stunt. Another comment about him looking like he wandered in from the county fair was loud enough for heads to turn in agreement. The old man didn't blink. He held the lead rope with quiet confidence, walking the horse in a slow, steady circle, never once acknowledging the judgment in the room. He had been in silence long enough to be immune to noise. From the announcer's booth came hesitation. The voice stumbled over Lot 48, listed simply as Wind Dancer. The handler was identified as Michael Cooper. No response came from the audience. No paddles raised. No interest. The name meant nothing in this world of pedigrees and prestige. But in the third row, a man in a dark blazer leaned forward, frowning. His fingers tapped the program nervously. Something about the horse's movement, the calm power, the way it held its head. It was too perfect, too familiar. Then it happened. An older gentleman near the judge's table stood slowly, his eyes wide with recognition. He stepped forward, his voice trembling as he announced that this wasn't Wind Dancer at all. This was Moonlight Legend, a horse declared dead 13 years ago in the Pine Valley fire. Gasps echoed throughout the arena. The name alone carried weight. Moonlight Legend had been a legend in the making, the last of a Triple Crown bloodline, until a mysterious fire ended its career before it began. No trace had ever been found, until now. The crowd froze in disbelief. Someone whispered, asking if Michael Cooper wasn't the stable boy they blamed for the fire. All eyes turned back to the old man standing silently in the ring, holding the reins of a ghost. In that moment, the laughter stopped. Eyes welled with shock and dawning comprehension. The room filled with the powerful and proud stood face to face with the truth they had buried for over a decade. And none of them, not a single one, was ready for what Michael had come to say. No one moved as Michael Cooper stood in the center of the ring, his hand resting gently on Moonlight Legend's bridle. The arena, just moments ago, filled with mocking laughter, was now cloaked in stunned silence. The old man's presence stirred something uncomfortable in everyone watching. Not just surprise, but guilt. The kind that only comes when ghosts from the past return with eyes that say, "I remember everything." 13 years ago, Pine Valley Stables had been the pride of Central Tennessee, home to champions, million-dollar foals, and a legacy envied across the country. That all changed in one night. The fire broke out just before dawn. By the time firefighters arrived, most of the barn had collapsed. 2 horses perished. A promising 3-year-old named Moonlight Legend was declared dead, and the blame, without trial or proof, fell squarely on the 17-year-old stable hand who had slept in the loft that night. Michael Cooper. Back then he was just a kid. No family, no money, no one to speak on his behalf. The media had a field day. Negligence, they called it. Reckless, incompetent, dangerous. Michael disappeared shortly after the investigation closed without charges. He had been erased from the sport, from society, from memory. And now, here he was, standing beside the very horse that was supposed to have died that night. In the crowd, a few faces began to shift from confusion to recognition. One man, Victor Blackwell, whose family once owned Pine Valley Stables, turned pale. He leaned toward his assistant, whispering something sharp about how this couldn't be proven. But there was fear in his eyes now. Because what if it was true? What if everything they built was about to be shaken by the man they tried to bury? Michael slowly raised his head, his voice low but clear, as he stated that this horse was never meant to be seen again. He didn't start that fire, and Moonlight Legend didn't die in it. They both survived. And now he wanted the truth to live too. His words hung heavy in the air. No dramatic gestures, no threats. Just truth. The kind that made powerful men squirm in their tailored suits. As murmurs spread like wildfire through the stands, no one noticed the silent nod exchanged between 2 reporters from the Racing Chronicle in the back row. They recognized the story now. They had covered the fire all those years ago. As they reached for their cameras, one of them whispered that this would change everything. Michael didn't wait for applause. He gently tugged on Moonlight Legend's lead and began to walk out of the ring, just as quietly as he had entered. But the silence didn't follow him this time. It cracked like thunder before a storm. The room broke into a chaotic hum. Some whispered his name with disbelief. Others pulled out their phones, snapping photos as if to capture proof of a ghost. A few simply stood frozen, unsure whether they were witnessing justice or the start of a scandal. Behind the scenes, Victor Blackwell moved quickly. He stormed out of his front row seat and headed straight to the private lounge, his assistant struggling to keep pace. He demanded information about where Michael had been, who registered the horse, and ordered surveillance on every journalist in the building. His voice was low and sharp, like a man trying to stay calm while the ground shifted under his feet. He had spent over a decade building his reputation as the future of Tennessee racing. He couldn't let a forgotten stable boy tear it all down in one night. Meanwhile, in the lobby, a different kind of conversation was unfolding. Eleanor Wilson, a retired breeder in her 70s, sat quietly in a corner, staring at her phone. Her hands trembled slightly. She had known Michael's mother before everything fell apart. She remembered the fire, the boy's terrified face, the way no one defended him, and the way the Blackwell family shut the investigation down so quickly. She muttered to herself that everyone knew something didn't add up. They just didn't want to ask the questions. Back in the arena, a few buyers began to question the catalog. A man in a blue suit cornered the announcer, pointing out that the horse had the Legend line gate visible in the left hind stride. He demanded to know who verified the paperwork and who allowed that horse on the docket. The announcer, red-faced and sweating, shuffled through his clipboard, realizing too late that the usual vet signatures were missing. Everything about Lot 48 had been slipped in quietly, almost like someone had known exactly what they were doing and exactly when to appear. In a side hallway, Michael stood with Moonlight Legend, now calm and grazing on some hay. Brought in by a staffer, he gently ran his hand down the horse's neck, whispering something only the animal could hear. His eyes were tired, not with age, but with the weight of years spent hiding. He had waited a long time for this, not for revenge, not even for redemption, but for the truth to have a name again. As the doors behind him opened and two journalists approached with their badges flashing, Michael didn't flinch. He turned slowly to face them, knowing the questions were coming, and knowing too that the story he was about to tell would destroy more than reputations. The reporters wasted no time. One of them, a sharp-eyed woman named Lisa Morgan, had been a rookie journalist when the fire at Pine Valley made headlines. Now, over a decade later, she was face to face with the man the media once vilified. She carefully asked Michael where he had been all this time. Michael looked at her for a long moment before answering, not with bitterness, but with the steady voice of someone who had carried silence like a cross. "Surviving," he said, and waiting for the right moment to show them they were wrong. He led them into a far stall where Moonlight Legend rested. The horse lifted its head, ears flicking toward Michael's voice like a dog to its master. Michael continued his story. The fire was no accident, and it wasn't his fault. He saw who lit it, but he was 17, poor, and scared. They needed someone easy to blame, and he was the only one who couldn't afford a lawyer. His hands clenched as he spoke, the pain still fresh beneath the calm. So he ran, took the horse, hid in the hills. He trained Moonlight Legend himself, under the radar. Never sold him, never raced him. He kept him alive so that one day the truth would have a witness. Lisa's partner James had already begun digging through public records. Pine Valley's insurance payout was massive, over $3 million. But what struck him as strange was how quickly the case closed. No formal charges, no independent investigation. That only happens when someone wants it buried. Michael nodded slowly. Victor Blackwell was just starting to take control of the family business. He had investors, big money on the line. That horse was supposed to be the crown jewel of his empire, until Michael found out Blackwell was planning to sell Moonlight Legend overseas under the table. The reporters exchanged a look that changed everything. The fire hadn't just been a tragedy, it had been a cover-up. If what Michael said was true, Blackwell had faked the horse's death to commit insurance fraud and framed a kid to make it all go away. The implications were enormous: criminal charges, financial ruin, and the collapse of an entire bloodline's legacy. When asked for proof, Michael opened a small leather satchel he had carried with him. Inside were old photographs, handwritten vet reports, and a tiny flash drive. He had kept everything, even when he had nothing else. By morning, the news had already spread beyond Nashville. Headlines flooded equestrian blogs and local media. Legendary stallion may have survived Pine Valley fire. Michael Cooper breaks silence after 13 years of exile. The once forgotten stable boy had become the center of a storm no one could stop. Even national outlets started circling, intrigued by the mystery of a lost horse, a ruined reputation, and the man who had waited over a decade to speak. In the quiet of a nearby motel room, Michael sat on the edge of the bed, flipping through an old creased photo album. Every page was filled with images from Pine Valley horses he had groomed, notes from the head trainer, and a smiling photo of him beside a younger Moonlight Legend, barely 2 years old at the time. He paused on one page, a grainy shot of Victor Blackwell, holding a lit cigarette beside a pile of hay bales. The timestamp, the night of the fire. Back at the auction grounds, Blackwell was losing his grip. Investors were pulling back. Legal advisors were requesting meetings. And to make things worse, Eleanor Wilson, the elderly breeder, who had remained silent for years, finally spoke out in a public statement. She admitted that she had been told to stay out of it when she asked questions after the fire. She knew Michael didn't do it, but back then, you didn't go up against the Blackwell name. Her words struck deep, cutting through years of manufactured silence. Lisa Morgan now officially working the story for a national feature. contacted a forensic vet who analyzed the bone structure and markings of Moonlight Legend. The vet's conclusion was definitive. This was the same horse. The scars matched. The patterns matched. This horse survived the fire. With that, Michael's story became not just believable, it became undeniable, and that made him dangerous. Later that afternoon, as Michael returned to the auction grounds to finalize the verification of Moonlight Legend's papers, he noticed something strange. His truck door was slightly ajar. Inside, the glove box had been rifled through. The flash drive containing his digital records was gone. He stood silently for a moment, breathing slow and steady. He didn't have to guess who had done it. Blackwell was panicking and getting sloppy, but Michael still had the originals, the physical ones. And more than that, he had the one thing Blackwell never expected. People who had once looked down on him, now starting to stand with him. The same crowd that had laughed when he entered the arena now watched him with cautious respect. And that respect was turning into something stronger. The next morning, the Golden Creek Arena was quieter than usual, but the tension hung thick in the air. Everyone knew something bigger was happening behind the scenes. Michael arrived early, not to make a scene but to finalize the DNA verification with the state equine board. As he stepped down from his truck, a black SUV pulled into the lot with tinted windows. Victor Blackwell stepped out alone, without his usual entourage. This wasn't business, it was personal now. They met by the stables. Neither man spoke at first. The silence between them was heavy. Years of buried history, wrapped in anger and quiet defiance. Then Blackwell finally broke it, asking Michael what he wanted. Money, fame. Did he think people would remember his version of the story in a week? Michael looked at him calmly. He didn't care if they remembered him. He cared that they remembered what Blackwell did. Blackwell's jaw tensed as he claimed Michael had no proof. Just a horse and some nostalgia. Michael shook his head slowly. He had eyewitnesses, vet confirmations, documents, and now he had people asking questions. Blackwell couldn't silence anymore. He paused, then added that Blackwell burned down that barn to erase a mistake, but didn't count on what survived the fire. Their voices were low, but several handlers nearby stopped what they were doing to listen. Whispers spread like sparks. Blackwell turned away, forcing a smile as if nothing had been said, but his eyes betrayed him. He was cornered, and he knew it. His empire had been built on a lie, and that lie was crumbling with every headline, every whisper, and every hoof step of the horse he thought was gone forever. Later that day, a formal investigation was announced. Lisa's article went live nationwide. While Blackwell's legal team scrambled to control the damage, Michael stood by Moonlight Legend in the quiet of a private paddock. He ran a hand along the horse's neck and whispered that they were almost there. But deep down, he knew the real reckoning was still to come. Victor Blackwell's empire was crumbling. By the end of the day, 3 major sponsors had released public statements, distancing themselves from his operations. One of them, ironically, the same family who helped fund the reconstruction of Pine Valley after the fire, called for a formal investigation into the 2012 insurance payout. Behind closed doors, Blackwell raged. His voice echoed through the office hallways, demanding answers from lawyers who had none. The foundation he built was cracking, and no one wanted to be buried in the rubble with him. Michael, meanwhile, kept his head down. With every news article and social media post that spread, the truth came with memories he had fought hard to suppress. He remembered the horses that didn't make it out of the fire, the people who turned their backs on him, the years spent in silence, learning to live in the margins of a world that had thrown him away. This wasn't about revenge. It never had been. It was about healing something that had been broken long before the fire. Eleanor Wilson invited him to dinner at her quiet farm that evening. Over a simple meal, they sat at a wooden table worn down by time, surrounded by the sounds of crickets and wind through the trees. She told him softly that when this all ended, people wouldn't just remember what he proved, they'd remember what he endured. Michael lowered his gaze, wishing someone had believed him when he was 17. Eleanor reached across the table and gently held his hand, telling him that now the whole world was listening. Elsewhere, Lisa Morgan received an anonymous email. Attached were bank records, forged documents, and deleted text messages. Undeniable evidence that Blackwell hadn't just covered up the fire. He had profited from it. He had funneled a portion of the insurance money into personal business ventures, laundering his guilt through shell companies and silence. This wasn't just about a horse anymore. It was about decades of corruption behind Tennessee's equestrian elite. The morning of the hearing arrived under heavy skies, the kind that pressed low and quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The State Equine Commission had called an emergency session to review the evidence brought forward by Lisa Morgan and several whistleblowers. The crowd that gathered outside the courthouse wasn't just made of journalists and breeders. It was filled with former employees of Pine Valley, small-town neighbors, and people who had followed the story from day one. Michael stood among them, not hiding, not running. For the first time in 13 years, he walked through the front door with his head high. Inside, the tension was suffocating. Blackwell arrived late, flanked by 2 attorneys, his face grim and pale. Cameras flashed as he passed, but he offered no comment. He hadn't slept in days. He knew the documents Lisa had submitted would be devastating. Bank transfers, forged reports, and now a signed affidavit from a former employee stating they had seen Blackwell sneaking back into the barn the night of the fire, holding a gas can. That single testimony turned whispers into thunder. When Michael took the stand, the room went still. He spoke softly, but clearly, recounting the night that changed his life. The smoke, the screaming horses, the moment he realized someone had locked the barn door from the outside. He saved who he could, he said, voice tight with emotion. But no one wanted to hear that back then. They just needed someone to blame, and he was easy. He glanced toward Blackwell without bitterness, only truth. As the evidence mounted, even Blackwell's lawyers began to withdraw. Whispers turned into gasps as Lisa revealed the final blow. The DNA report confirming beyond question that the horse known as Moonlight Legend was alive and had been hidden all these years. The commission members exchanged glances. One of them, an older man with decades in the industry, finally spoke, saying this didn't just expose fraud, it exposed a failure of their entire system to protect the innocent. The weeks following the hearing were a blur of headlines, legal motions, and public apologies. Victor Blackwell resigned from all positions related to racing and breeding. His family's name, once carved into the foundation of Tennessee's horse industry, now echoed with disgrace. Lawsuits followed swiftly. Investors demanded restitution. Insurance fraud investigators reopened files. And for the first time in his life, Blackwell was powerless. But none of it gave Michael back the years he had lost. Michael received countless messages, some from strangers offering support, others from people who had once doubted him, now expressing regret. He answered very few. He spent most of his time on a small farm outside of town, donated anonymously by a former racing judge who had followed his story. The land wasn't much, an old barn, a few acres of pasture, but it was quiet, peaceful, and it was enough for him and Moonlight Legend to finally rest. One afternoon, Lisa Morgan visited with a small team to film a follow-up interview. She asked Michael what he planned to do next. He paused, looking out at Moonlight Legend grazing under a late autumn sun. He didn't know, he said honestly. He never planned past proving the truth, but maybe he'd teach some kids how to ride or how to care for horses. Maybe he'd help someone find the voice he didn't have back then. His voice caught for a second. That would mean something. Not far from that same field, Eleanor Wilson had started a foundation, the Moonlight Project, aimed at supporting underprivileged youth interested in equine work. She named Michael an honorary co-founder, though he refused to make a speech. He told them to let the horse do the talking, smiling faintly as Moonlight Legend walked beside him during the ribbon cutting. The community, once so quick to judge, now watched him with a kind of reverence, not because he was a hero, but because he stood back up. One evening, Michael found an envelope at his door. No return address. Inside was a photo, an old black and white image of him as a boy, brushing down Moonlight Legend as a foal. On the back, in shaky handwriting, were the words, "You never stopped believing. I was wrong." The initials VB were enough. He stood there a long time staring at the message. Though it didn't erase the past, it softened something inside him, a fracture slowly mending. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Michael walked back to the barn. The shadows were long, but they no longer scared him. He had walked through fire, real and metaphorical, and come out carrying more than just scars. He came out with truth, and though the journey had nearly broken him, he had found something rare and powerful on the other side: peace. But one final step remained. Months passed. The frenzy of media attention faded, as stories always do, and life settled into something quieter. Michael Cooper didn't chase interviews, and he declined every invitation to speak at galas or on talk shows. He preferred mornings in the pasture, evenings in the barn, and a life that moved slowly. Honestly, Moonlight Legend remained by his side through it all, no longer a secret, no longer a symbol of pain, but a survivor, just like him. There was a race that spring, a small, local event held not far from where Pine Valley had once stood. They didn't run it for money. It wasn't televised, but word had spread, and the stands were when Michael led Moonlight Legend into the ring, not to compete, but simply to walk the track one last time. Every person in the crowd stood. Hats came off, hands clapped, slow and respectful. It wasn't a race, it was a homecoming. As they reached the final stretch, Michael stopped in the center of the track. He looked around, eyes slightly glassy. This was where it all started, and where somehow it all came back around. A boy once blamed for a fire had returned as a man with nothing to prove, only something to honor. He reached up and gently touched Moonlight Legend's neck. They had made it. They had finally been seen. This story reminds us that sometimes the most powerful people in the room aren't those in designer suits with millions in the bank, but those with the courage to stand up for truth, no matter how long it takes. If you found this story inspiring, please like and subscribe for more incredible stories. Truth always finds its way into the light. Sometimes it just needs someone brave enough to lead it there.